She pressed her bare hand against a man's gunshot wound, blood soaking through her fingers, and didn't flinch once. Not when the second explosion hit. Not when the screaming started. Not when the Marine beside her grabbed her arm and begged, "What do we do?" She looked him dead in the eyes and said, calm as a Sunday morning, "You follow me, and you don't stop moving." Nobody at that base knew who Sarah Bennett really was. They were about to find out. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The thing about forward operating Base Kestrel was that it never truly slept. Even in the hours before dawn, when the desert air dropped cold enough to sting the lungs and the stars hung low over the compound walls, there was always noise. The low hum of generators, the crackle of radio chatter bleeding through tent walls, boots on gravel, someone coughing in the barracks. Somewhere always the distant echo of something burning. Staff Sergeant Ray Dolan had spent 14 months at FO Kestrel, and he knew every sound this place made. He knew which generator rattled on Tuesdays. He knew the specific pitch of Lieutenant Carrasco's laugh. He knew the sound of the chow hall at 0500 aluminum trays scraping coffee, percolating men talking low about nothing important, because talking about nothing important was the only thing that kept them sane. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was the woman who had been working the medical station for the last 6 weeks. Nurse Sarah Bennett. She arrived on a Tuesday. Quiet transfer paperwork, no fanfare, no ceremony. One of the supply trucks dropped her off along with 3 crates of IV bags and a new field radio. She had one duffel bag. She said hello to exactly 2 people before disappearing into the medical ward and not coming back out until her shift ended. Dolan had noticed her on day 3, not because she was striking, though she was in the way that people who carry themselves with absolute stillness tend to be. Not because she caused trouble. It was the opposite. She caused no trouble at all, and in a forward operating base where everybody eventually rubs somebody the wrong way, that itself was unusual. He noticed her because she never looked surprised by anything. He'd watched her one afternoon while getting a shoulder wrap changed, old rotator cuff tear, nothing dramatic, and a new corpsman had dropped an entire tray of instruments on the floor with a catastrophic crash. Every single person in that tent jumped. Dolan himself had reached for his sidearm by pure reflex. Patients bolted upright. Doc Hensley let out a string of profanity that lasted a solid 12 seconds. Sarah Bennett had looked up from the chart she was reading, glanced at the mess on the floor and said, "I'll get that," then went back to reading. Like the sound of crashing metal in a combat zone was nothing. Like her nervous system simply did not process alarm the same way other people's did. Dolan had filed that away somewhere in the back of his mind and said nothing about it. The other Marines had their own observations. Corporal Eddie Reyes, 23 years old from Albuquerque, with opinions about everything, told Dolan at the chow line one morning that the new nurse was kind of creepy quiet. "She doesn't talk," Eddie said, scraping powdered eggs onto his tray. "Like at all. I said good morning to her yesterday and she just looked at me. Not rude, just evaluating. Like she was deciding something." "Maybe she decided you weren't worth talking to," Dolan said. "Man, everyone's worth talking to. That's my whole thing." "That is unfortunately true." Eddie pointed his fork. "You don't think it's weird? She's been here 6 weeks. Nobody knows anything about her. Where she trained, where she came from, nothing." "She's a nurse," Dolan said. "She's here to keep us alive when we do stupid things." "Sergeant, I'm telling you, something's off." Dolan had just taken a long sip of coffee and said nothing, because the honest answer, "Yeah, I know, I see it," too, was a door he didn't particularly want to open at 0530 on a Wednesday. He opened it about 3 hours later by accident. He'd gone to the medical station to return a borrowed pulse oximeter, small thing. Doc Hensley had been looking for it, and he heard voices inside before he pushed the door open. He stopped, hand on the frame, not because he was eavesdropping, because the voice he heard was one he didn't recognize at first, and then he did, and that was the problem. It was Sarah Bennett's voice, except it wasn't the flat, measured tone she used when she said "hold still" or "this will sting." It was different, precise, instructional. The kind of voice that had given orders before and expected them to be followed. "Wound cavity is larger than it looks on the surface. You pack from the deepest point out, not the other way. If you pack from the outside in, you trap infection and you kill the patient. Understand?" A younger voice, one of the new medics, Dolan thought, answered nervously, "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am, call me Sarah. And don't nod if you don't actually understand. Tell me what I just said back to me." A pause, then the medic hesitantly, "Pack from the deepest point out. Make sure there's no trapped space inside." "Better, now again. Faster." Dolan stood outside that door for another 30 seconds. Then he quietly backed away, still holding the pulse oximeter, and went back to his tent. He sat on the edge of his cot. He thought about what he'd just heard. He thought about the way she'd said, "You kill the patient," not "the patient could die," not "you might cause further injury." Direct, clinical, the language of someone who had watched people die from exactly that mistake. He thought about the fact that she hadn't been teaching that medic. She'd been drilling him. "Something's off," Eddie had said. "Yeah, maybe." That evening, Dolan made a quiet, informal inquiry. Nothing official. He just asked around, anyone know where Bennett transferred from? Anyone seen her paperwork? The answer he got 3 times in a row was a variation of the same thing. "It's in the system somewhere, I just haven't looked it up." Or, "I think she came from Ramstein maybe." Or simply, "Don't know, man." Which was in itself an answer. People at a FOB talked constantly. They traded histories the way civilians traded business cards within 48 hours of meeting someone. You knew their hometown, their MOS, where they did their training, whether they were married, what their wife's name was, what their plan was when they got out. It was survival behavior as much as social knowing. Who was standing next to you really knowing was how you stayed alive. 6 weeks of Sarah Bennett, and nobody knew anything. He went to Captain Yardley. Yardley was a compact, efficient woman who had been running the medical station at Kestrel for 8 months, and who did not tolerate anything she considered administrative noise. She looked up from her desk when Dolan knocked, read his expression, and said, "Whatever it is, make it short." "The new nurse," Dolan said. "Bennett. Where'd she come from?" Yardley's expression shifted barely, but Dolan caught it, a slight tightening around the eyes. "She's a contract nurse with the Navy Medical Corps. Her credentials are current and fully verified. She passed her background screening." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "No," Yardley said. "It's not." She leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "She came to me with a letter of placement from a Colonel Westfield at Naval Special Warfare Command. The letter requested that her assignment be processed without additional inquiry. I processed it." Dolan stared at her. "Naval Special Warfare Command. That's what the letter said." "Captain, that's—" "I know what it is, Sergeant." Her voice was quiet but final. "She's here. She's good at her job. I strongly suggest you let it rest." He let it rest for approximately 47 more hours. The attack came at 0340 on a Friday morning, not at the wire, not at the gate, through the drainage channel on the eastern wall, a gap that had been on the maintenance list for 11 weeks and never got fixed because there were always higher priorities. There were always higher priorities until suddenly there weren't. The first explosion hit the motor pool. Dolan was on his feet before the sound finished reverberating. Boots half-laced, body armor half-buckled, running on the muscle memory of 14 months of drills. Around him, the base erupted into control case, men shouting, weapons being grabbed, radio traffic flooding every channel at once. He heard, "Eastern wall breached, repeat. Eastern wall breached." He heard, "Motor pool is on fire. We've got wounded." He heard, "Medical station. They're going to the medical station." And he ran. He hit the door of the medical tent at a full sprint and nearly collided with Corpsman Alvarez, who was backing out of it with both hands raised and his face the color of chalk. "What?" Dolan started. "She's already in there," Alvarez said, and his voice was strange. Not scared exactly. "Something else. She just took over." Dolan pushed inside. The medical station was a different world. Outside was noise and panic and fire. Inside was organized. Terrifyingly, impossibly organized. Sarah Bennett stood at the center of it like a point on a compass. She had already moved 3 of the 4 hospital beds to create a clear path from the entrance to the surgical bay. She had already elevated the 2 most critical patients and had IVs running. She had Medic Torres stationed at the door, armed with the instructions. Dolan could only partially hear. "Anyone comes through who isn't ours. You tell me before you engage. You hear me? Tell me first." She turned when Dolan entered, and her eyes did that thing he'd noticed before, that rapid, complete assessment like a camera shutter firing. "Dolan," she said. Not a question. She knew his name. He'd never formally introduced himself. "How many men on the eastern wall?" "I don't guess. 4, maybe 6. Then we have approximately 8 minutes before they get through the secondary barrier and start moving toward us. I need you to block that window." She pointed without looking. "And I need someone on the roof of the supply building with eyes on the approach lane. Can you do that?" Dolan's brain had been in combat mode for 4 minutes. He was a staff sergeant with 14 months in theater. He had been shot at 17 separate times and had stopped counting indirect fire. And standing there in that medical tent, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like the least qualified person in the room. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that?" "Good." She was already moving to the next patient. And Dolan, take the medic with you. I need a shooter out there who won't panic. Alvarez stays with me. He stopped, turned back. You're staying here. She looked up from the wound she was packing. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were steady. Everything about her was steady, and it was the most unnatural and simultaneously the most reassuring thing he had ever seen. Someone has to, she said. Now go. He went. Outside, he found Eddie Reyes crouched behind a supply container rifle up eyes wide. Dolan grabbed him by the collar. You good? Define good. Functional. Are you functional? Yeah, I'm functional. Come on. They moved to the supply building 300 meters through a base that had become a different planet in the last 6 minutes. Smoke. Gunfire closer now and coming from 2 directions. The motor pool was fully involved, orange light painting, everything. Somewhere someone was screaming a name. Dolan kept his head down and kept moving. On the roof, Eddie set up behind a ventilation unit and got eyes on the eastern approach. Dolan got on the radio. Command, this is Dolan. I have a position on the supply building roof. I need to know the status of the eastern breach. Static. Then a voice he barely recognized, Carrasco. Lieutenant Carrasco, but the voice was wrong, too high, too quick. Dolan, we've got approximately 12 to 15 hostiles through the breach. They split into 2 groups. One is heading for the armor room. One is heading, The radio cut out. When Carrasco say again, the second group is heading where static. Eddie's voice low and tight. Sergeant, I see them. Dolan looked over the ventilation unit. 12 figures, moving in pairs, moving fast, moving with the kind of organized, purposeful speed that told every part of his brain that had survived 14 months that these were not amateurs, and they were heading directly for the medical station. He keyed the radio. Bennett, he said, and then stopped because that wasn't the right channel. She wasn't on comms. He didn't even know if she had a radio static. Then, I hear you. He froze. How are you? I picked up Alvarez's secondary radio. What do you see? He exhaled. 12 hostiles organized. 2-man pairs. They know what they're doing, Sarah. These aren't amateurs. A beat of silence. Just 1 beat. Then, how far out? 3 minutes, maybe less. Another silence. He could hear her breathing slow, controlled the kind of breathing you had to practice to get that way under these conditions. Okay, she said finally. And something in that single word, the weight of it, the absolute terrifying calm of it, made the hair on his arm stand up. Okay, he repeated. What does okay mean? Her voice was quiet, almost gentle. It means I've handled worse. He believed her. He didn't know why. He had known this woman for 6 weeks. He knew nothing about her. He had no evidence, none zero to support the idea that she was capable of what she seemed to be implying. But he believed her. And that more than anything, more than the smoke and the gunfire and the 12 armed men moving through the dark toward the one building on this base that held their wounded, that was the thing that truly unsettled him. Because Dolan trusted his gut. He had spent 14 months trusting his gut. And his gut wasn't telling him that Sarah Bennett was someone to be afraid of. His gut was telling him she was someone to stay behind. Eddie, he said, yeah. You remember what you said, that something was off about her. A pause. Below them, the 12 figures kept moving. Yeah, Eddie said. I think you were right. Is that good or bad? Dolan watched the figures close the distance to the medical station. Watched the door. Watched the dark. Waited for the sound that he knew was coming. I genuinely don't know yet, he said. And then the shooting started. The first shot came from above. Not from his position. From the medical station itself, from somewhere near the roofline, a single precise crack that was unlike every other sound of gunfire on that base tonight. Not an automatic burst, not a panicked spray. One shot. Controlled. One of the 12 figures dropped. Eddie grabbed Dolan's arm. Did that come from the... Yes, Dolan said. How did she... I don't know. And the remaining 11 figures scattered, breaking their formation, and for just a moment, just 3 or 4 seconds, the organized assault became something less organized. And in that moment, Dolan saw it clearly. Whoever was shooting from that medical station had not only hit a target in the dark at significant range, but had done it knowing exactly how a group of armed men would respond. Had done it to break their formation, to buy time, to create chaos that could be controlled. That wasn't nursing school. That was training. Sergeant, Eddie whispered. Yeah. Who is she? The radio crackled. Her voice came through, still calm, still quiet, as if she were giving post-op instructions on a Tuesday afternoon. Dolan, I'm going to need your team to push their left flank in approximately 90 seconds. Don't engage, just push. Drive them right. Why right? Because I'll be watching the right. He stared at the radio. He looked at Eddie. Eddie had his rifle up and ready, and his expression was somewhere between stunned and reverent. You heard her, Dolan said, and he moved. 90 seconds. That was all she had asked for. Push the left flank, drive them right, and trust her. Dolan had followed orders from generals who gave him less confidence than that single radio transmission. He didn't examine it. He didn't question it. He grabbed Eddie by the shoulder, pointed right, and they moved. They came around the south side of the supply building at a low sprint, and the moment their boots hit the gravel on the far side, Dolan fired twice into the air, not at anyone, not to hit anyone, just noise. Just pressure. Just enough to make 11 armed men feel the walls closing in from one more direction. It worked. He heard them shift, heard boots scraping, voices cutting short the unmistakable sound of a group recalculating its options under fire. They moved right, exactly the way she said they would. And then the second shot cracked through the dark. Clean, precise. From the roof line of the medical station, maybe 60 meters to the north. Another figure dropped. Then a third shot so fast behind the second that Dolan almost mistook them for one. Another figure went down. 3 shots. 3 targets. And the whole formation broke, not the controlled repositioning of trained fighters, but the genuine scrambling break of men who suddenly didn't know where death was coming from and couldn't afford to find out. Eddie stopped running. He just stopped right there in the middle of an active firefight and stared at the roof line of the medical station. "Sergeant," he breathed. "That's... Keep moving." Dolan grabbed his collar again and hauled him forward. "Eyes on your sector, Reyes. She just took out 3 guys in I know. From a rooftop she couldn't have been set up on for more than... Eddie, I know, move." They moved, but Dolan felt it too, the thing Eddie was struggling to put into words. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't reflexive. It wasn't lucky. It was a shooter who had already identified her position before the engagement started, who had already ranged the approach lane, who had fired knowing exactly where the targets would be because she had sent Dolan to put them there. That was not a nurse with a rifle. That was a sniper running a coordinated kill sequence. The radio crackled. "Dolan, east side, 2 of them broke off toward the generator building. I can't cover that angle from here." He was already turning. "On it. Be careful. They're not panicking anymore. They're adapting." "How do you know?" A pause, just 1 heartbeat long. "Because I would." The 2 men at the generator building were professionals. Dolan saw that immediately when he and Eddie came around the corner and caught them in mid-position, not fleeing, not hiding, setting up. One of them was taking a knee with his weapon trained on the medical station's front door. The other was scanning for exactly the kind of approach that Dolan was currently making. The second man saw him at the same moment Dolan saw him. It happened fast, too fast for thought. Fast enough that it was pure body and training and the 14 months of accumulated instinct that kept Ray Dolan alive on this earth. He went left. Eddie went right. The man's first burst went between them. Dolan returned fire and didn't miss. 3 seconds, 4 shots, 2 men. Then silence in that immediate space, the specific heavy silence that falls after violence. When your ears are ringing and your hands are shaking and your body is flooded with something that isn't quite adrenaline and isn't quite fear, but is some ancient combination of both. Eddie pressed his back against the generator casing, breathing hard. "Tell me that's all of them." Dolan counted in his head. 12 started, 3 down from her shots, 2 down here, 7 unaccounted for. "Oh good," Eddie said. 7, the radio, I heard shots. Report. 2 down on the east side, Dolan said. Generator building is clear. You're looking at 7 still out there. 6, she corrected. I just watched 1 go down near the armory. Someone on your security team got lucky. Or good. Could be both. A beat. Dolan, I need you back inside. He frowned. I'm more useful out here. There are patients in this building who are going to die if I spend the next 10 minutes on this roof instead of on them. I need you inside so I can trust what's happening at that door. Can I trust you at that door? He was already moving. Yeah. Good. Come in through the supply entrance. Keep your head down. The remaining 6 have repositioned. They're going to try the building from 2 sides this time. How do you know? Because, she said again with that same terrifying patience, it's what I would do in Ostrat. He came through the supply entrance with Eddie on his heels, and the first thing he saw when he pushed into the main ward was Alvarez standing rigid against the far wall with his rifle up, eyes locked on the front entrance, sweat running down the side of his face in a straight line. The second thing he saw was the patients, 6 wounded men. 2 post-surgical, unable to move. 1 with a chest tube and breathing carefully. 3 with wounds that had been stabilized but not resolved, on all of them awake, all of them watching the door, and none of them panicking. That was the thing that hit Dolan hardest. Not the combat, not the sound of gunfire still trading outside, not even what he'd seen on the roofline. It was the patients' men who were hurt, who were vulnerable, who had every reason in the world to be terrified, and they were calm. He looked at the man nearest to him. Corporal Walsh, leg wound, 2 surgeries in the last 4 days. Walsh caught his eye and gave a short nod toward the far corner of the room. Dolan followed the nod. Sarah Bennett was climbing down from the interior ladder that accessed the roof hatch rifle slung across her back, moving with the loose efficiency of someone who had just finished a task rather than someone who had just killed 3 men. She hit the floor unsung, the rifle leaned it against the wall, and turned to the nearest IV stand to check the drip rate, like she was picking up where she left off. "You good?" Dolan asked, and then felt immediately strange about the question, because it was the kind of thing you asked someone who'd been through something, and the look on her face when she turned toward him suggested that what she'd just been through did not register in her system as something. "I need to check Walsh's drain," she said. "And Martinez has a pressure reading I'm not happy with. Sit down if you're not going to be useful, Dolan." "I'm going to be useful." "Then get Alvarez to switch positions. He's been on that door for 12 minutes, and he's starting to tighten up. Swap him out, keep him moving, keep him breathing." Dolan looked at Alvarez. She was right, the corpsman's knuckles were white on his rifle shoulders, creeping up toward his ears. The specific posture of someone whose body was preparing to shut down. "Alvarez," Dolan said, "take the south window. Reyes has the door." Alvarez moved without a word. The act of moving helped he could see it immediately in the corpsman's shoulders, the way they dropped 2 inches the moment his feet started moving. Something to do, somewhere to be. The body needed purpose, or it started consuming itself. Eddie took the door. He set up properly back against the frame, not silhouetted rifle ready. Dolan watched him for a second and then turned back to the room. Sarah was at Walsh's side, checking the drain with one hand and writing something on his chart with the other. Walsh was watching her with an expression that Dolan recognized because he'd seen it before, not on patients but on soldiers. The expression of a man who has decided to put his life in another person's hands and found against all reasonable expectation that he trusts them. "She came down from the roof," Walsh said quietly to Dolan. Not to Sarah, to Dolan, like he needed to report something he'd witnessed. "After the 3rd shot, she didn't run. She just walked to the ladder, like she was going to get a cup of coffee." "I know," Dolan said. "Who is she, Sergeant?" Before Dolan could answer, Sarah said, without looking up from Walsh's drain from 6 feet away, "I'm the person keeping your drain from getting infected, Walsh, so let's stay focused on that for now." Walsh blinked. "You heard that. I hear everything." She capped the syringe she'd been using and moved to Martinez's monitor. "And in answer to your question, I'm someone who is going to need absolute quiet in this room in about 45 seconds. Dolan went still. "Why?" She tilted her head slightly, listening. Her eyes went to a specific point on the ceiling, the north wall, maybe 3 meters up, and stayed there. "Because they're on the roof," she said. Nobody moved. The room held its breath. And then above them, the unmistakable creak of weight on corrugated metal. Slow, deliberate. Someone trying very hard not to be heard, trying and failing because Sarah Bennett was in the room. "2," she said, still in that same quiet tone, moving toward the north vent. "Eddie, do not fire until I tell you. The angle from your position will go through the wall into Martinez." Eddie froze. "Copy?" "Alvarez south window, if they drop anything through the roof, vent it goes right. You angle right, understand it?" "Understood." Alvarez's voice had steadied. The task was helping. The clarity was helping. "Dolan, middle of the room, if the vent cover comes off, your job is the patients. Get them down and keep them there. Not me, not Reyes, not yourself, the patients." "Got it." She picked up the rifle again. Above them, the creaking stopped. For 10 full seconds, nothing happened. The silence was the worst kind, the kind that had something hiding inside it. Dolan felt his heart in his back teeth. Then the vent cover exploded inward. 2 things happened at the same time. Dolan lunged for the nearest patient bed, grabbing the frame and hauling it sideways and down, and Sarah fired twice through the open vent from directly beneath it, muzzle up without flinching, at the debris raining down on her face. Above them, a single heavy thud. Then nothing. She lowered the rifle, checked the chamber, looked at Dolan. "You good?" He was crouched over Walsh's bed, one arm across the man's chest, his own back to the ceiling, like it would have done a damn thing against whatever came through that vent. "Fine," he said. "Martinez, here," Martinez croaked from the next bed. "Still here." "Your blood pressure is going to be terrible after this," she said, and there was something almost human in her voice when she said it, almost warm. "I'm going to need you to breathe for me. In through the neck, out through the mouth. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good man." She turned back to the vent, listened. Then she looked at Dolan. 4 left. "How are you counting?" "I counted 12 coming in. 3 on approach, 2 at the generator, 1 near the armory, 2 on the roof." She said it the way an accountant reads figures. Flat. Factual. 4 left. "And where are the 4? That," she said, "is what I'm working on." Ashima. She got on the radio, not Dolan's frequency, a different one, a frequency that Dolan did not recognize, that he was reasonably certain was not part of the standard FOB communication protocol. She spoke in clipped, precise language. Kestrel Medical, this is Bravo 7. I need a perimeter status on the south and west approaches, and I need it right now. Static. Then a voice not from the base, not from anyone Dolan recognized. Male, calm, professional, in the exact same register as her. Bravo 7, we have 2 tangos stationary at the south gate and 2 moving west along the exterior wall. QRF is 8 minutes out. 8 minutes is too long. Understood. Can you hold? She looked around the room, at the wounded, at Dolan and Eddie and Alvarez, at the vent in the ceiling that now had 2 dead men on top of it, at the IV bags running, at the monitors beeping, at 6 men who had trusted their lives to her 60 minutes ago and were still alive because of it. I can hold, she said. Copy Bravo 7, 8 minutes. She clicked off, looked at Dolan. He was staring at her. So was Eddie. So was Alvarez. Even Walsh, propped up on his good arm, was staring. She raised an eyebrow. What? Bravo 7, Dolan said. She said nothing. That's not a medical call sign. Still nothing. Sarah. She set the radio down, picked up Martinez's chart. Read it. Put it down. His BP is stabilizing. I don't care about his blood pressure right now. You should, it's your job. Who are you? The question came out louder than he intended, with more edge than he'd planned, and the room went dead quiet. Walsh stopped breathing for a second. Eddie's eyes cut sideways. Even the monitor seemed to pause. Because you are not just a nurse. You came in here 6 weeks ago with 1 duffel bag, and you didn't talk to anybody, and you just ran a coordinated defensive action from a medical rooftop in the middle of an active assault, and you have a call sign on a frequency I've never heard in 14 months at this base. So I'm going to ask you one more time, who are you? She looked at him. That look, the same look she'd given the corpsman who dropped the tray. The same look she'd given Eddie's good morning 3 days ago. The look that saw everything and gave nothing back. Then something shifted, just slightly. Something in the set of her jaw, the line of her shoulders. I'm the person who is going to get every single one of you through the next 8 minutes, she said. And after that, you can ask me anything you want. Deal. He stared at her for a long moment. Walsh said quietly from the bed, Sergeant, I take the deal. Dolan exhaled through his nose. Fine. Good. She was already moving, because the 2 on the south gate just stopped being stationary. She knew it before the radio confirmed it, before anyone else in the room had any way of knowing it. She just moved, repositioned, told Alvarez to come off the south window and get behind the medication cabinet, told Eddie to change his angle by 15 degrees left, told Dolan to get low. Then she did something that Dolan would describe later in the debrief, in the written report, in every telling of that night for the rest of his life, as the single most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in 14 months of combat. She sat down, on the floor, back against the wall, rifle across her knees, eyes closed. Sarah. Quiet. The south gate. Quiet Dolan. He went quiet. He didn't know why. He just did. For 30 seconds, she sat there with her eyes closed and the gunfire trading outside and the sound of boots somewhere to the south getting closer, and she breathed. Slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm she told Martinez to use. And then her eyes opened, and she looked at the exact spot on the south wall where 4 seconds later, the door came in. She was already raising the rifle when it happened. She fired once. The man who came through the door went down before his second foot crossed the threshold. The second man, the one behind him, who had expected the first man to draw fire, caught the door on his shoulder, stumbled, and Eddie took him before he could recover. 2 seconds, 2 down, 2 left. She was on her feet before the echo died. Alvarez, check that doorway and hold it. Don't let them take that entrance back. She was striding across the room. Dolan, with me. Where the last 2 aren't coming inside. He followed her because that's what his legs did. They followed her the way they'd been doing all night, the way every person in that room had been doing. Not because of rank, not because of protocol, but because in the geography of that building, in the center of that night, Sarah Bennett was the fixed point that everything else orbited, the thing that didn't move when everything else was moving. Then where are they? He asked. Leaving, she said. And there was something in her voice when she said it that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't relief. Something older and quieter and heavier than both. They're running, yes. How do you know? She pushed the supply entrance door open just enough to see the eastern approach. The first gray light of morning was beginning, thin, cold, barely there. And in that light, 2 figures moving fast, moving away, disappearing into the distance. because she said they came in planning to overwhelm a medical station with minimal security in the middle of the night. She watched them go. Her voice was even. They didn't plan for me. Dolan stood in the doorway beside her and watched the two figures until they were gone. The gunfire across the base had thinned. There were still pockets, the armory, the south gate, but the organized assault was over. You could feel it the way you could always feel it. The specific quality of silence when a battle shifts from fought to finished. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. She stood there too, still, watching the direction the men had gone, even after they'd long disappeared. Like she was reading something in the space they'd left behind. Finally, Dolan said, 8 minutes. What? You said you could hold for 8 minutes. He looked at her. That was closer to 20. Something crossed her face then. Something that lasted only a moment before she locked it back down. But he saw it, something that looked almost briefly like relief. Like the things she'd been holding all night had shifted weight just slightly. The QRF was late, she said. Yeah, it happens. Yeah, another silence. Longer this time. Sarah, he said it quietly. Not a challenge anymore. Not the sergeant voice. Just a name. You saved every person in that building tonight. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the dawn, instead that thin gray edge of morning coming up slow over the eastern distance. Not finished yet, she said. Go check your people. He went, but he looked back once. She was still standing in the doorway, rifle at her side, watching the morning arrive with those eyes that never stopped calculating. And in the pale early light for just 1 second, before she turned back inside, she looked like something different than she had 6 weeks ago when she stepped off that supply truck. With one duffel bag, she looked like exactly who she was. He just didn't know the name for it yet. Inside, Walsh was the first to speak when Dolan came back through the ward. She okay? She's fine. Of course she is. Walsh settled back against his pillow. Sergeant, I've been in this bed for 4 days and I've watched about 100 people walk through this room. Doctors, nurses, officers, all of them good people. Competent people. He paused. She's not like any of them. No, Dolan agreed. What do you think she was before this? Dolan thought about the letter from Naval Special Warfare Command. He thought about the call sign Bravo 7 spoken with the ease of a name. He thought about 3 shots in the dark, precisely placed not to defend a position but to break a formation. He thought about a woman who sat on the floor with her eyes closed in the middle of a firefight and opened them 4 seconds before the door came in. I don't know, he said, but I'm going to find out. The radio crackled. A new voice official clipped. The voice of the arriving QRF. FOB Kestrel, this is Bravo Element. We are on approach ET. 2 minutes. Report status. Dolan keyed up. Bravo Element, this is Staff Sergeant Dolan. The medical station is secure. Repeat, medical station is secure. All patients accounted for. Copy that, Sergeant. Casualties. He looked around the room. Walsh with his leg. Martinez with his pressure. 4 others, all where they'd been when the night started. Alvarez in the doorway. Eddie putting his rifle up with hands that were only now beginning to shake. The adrenaline leaving the body all at once the way it always did, like a tide going out. No new casualties. Not one. 0 new casualties on our end, he said. A pause from the other side. Then repeat that. 0 new casualties. Medical station held. No losses. Another pause. Longer. Sergeant, how many were inside when the attack started? He counted. The patients, the staff, himself, Eddie Alvarez. 11, he said. And you're telling me 11 people held a medical station against a 12-man assault force and took 0 casualties. Dolan looked at the door where Sarah Bennett was walking back and brushing dust off her sleeve, already heading toward Martinez's monitor, because his blood pressure was what she'd said it was going to be, and she didn't stop working. She never stopped working. We had good help, Dolan said. What does that mean? He watched her check the IV line, watched her say something quiet to Martinez, watched Martinez, tough, quiet 27-years-old shrapnel in his left side, actually smile. I'll explain in the debrief, Dolan said. He clicked off the radio. He stood in the center of the medical station as the QRF vehicles could be heard pulling into the compound, as the thin morning light grew stronger, as the sounds of the base, the real base, the everyday base, the generators and the gravel and the radio chatter slowly reasserted themselves over the sounds of the night. And he thought, I have been here 14 months. I thought I knew every sound this place made, every person in it, every corner of it. I was wrong about one. The QRF arrived with a kind of organized noise that only exists on the other side of a crisis engines, cutting boots, hitting gravel information, voices giving clean orders to a situation that was already over. Colonel James Brennan stepped out of the lead vehicle at 0412 hours and stood in the center of Fub Kestrel with his hands on his hips, reading the compound the way a man reads a room he walked into too late for the conversation. He looked at the motor pool still smoldering. He looked at the eastern wall where the breach team had cut through the drainage channel. He looked at the armory, which had held. He looked at the bodies, 9 confirmed, laid out near the south gate with the grim efficiency of men who had done this before. Then he looked at the medical station, and he walked toward it without talking to anyone. Dolan was outside the entrance when Brennan arrived drinking coffee that tasted like it had been made by someone who had recently survived a firefight, which it had. Brennan looked at him, once looked at the building, looked back at him. "How many inside?" Brennan asked. 11, all alive, 0 new casualties. Brennan's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. "Aero." "Yes, sir." "Against a 12-man assault force." "Yes, sir." Brennan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't processing the information, but rather deciding what to do with information already processed. "Who's your senior medical officer?" Dolan took a long sip of the terrible coffee. "That," he said, "is a complicated question." Brennan looked at him sharply. "Sergeant." "Captain Yardley is the assigned senior medical officer, sir. But she was in the South Barracks when the attack started and didn't reach the station until the QRF arrived." He paused. "Someone else ran the defense." "Who?" Dolan opened the door and held it. "Better if you see for yourself, sir." The first thing Brennan saw when he walked into the medical ward was Sarah Bennett on her knees next to Martinez's bed, one hand on the man's wrist, so eyes on the clock on the wall counting. Not looking up when a colonel entered. Not interrupting her count. Finishing it, whatever she was checking, before she looked up at all. And even then, the look she gave Brennan was the same look she gave everyone. Complete. Measuring. Unimpressed by rank. Brennan stopped walking. He stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he said very quietly, "Bennett." She stood up. "Colonel, you're supposed to be dead." The room went silent so fast, it was like someone had pulled a plug. Walsh stopped moving. Eddie's hand froze on his rifle. Even Martinez, who was half sedated and had been drifting peacefully for the last 40 minutes, opened one eye. Dolan felt the air change. He looked at Brennan. He looked at Sarah. She was looking at Brennan with something that was not quite surprise, more like the expression of someone who had known a particular moment was coming and had spent considerable energy not thinking about when. "Sir," she said, and the word landed flat. Not disrespect, just distance. "How long have you been here?" Brennan asked. 6 weeks. "Under what name?" "My name." Brennan exhaled through his nose. Slow and controlled the breath of a man managing something. "Is Westfield aware you're at this installation?" "Colonel Westfield processed my placement." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "He's aware." "Bennett." Brennan's voice dropped lower, not threatening, but something more unsettling than threatening. The voice of a man who knew things and was choosing his words around them with extreme care. "You were listed as inactive." "I am inactive. I'm a nurse." "You killed 4 men tonight." "I defended a medical station." She looked at him steadily. "Those are different things, sir." Brennan stared at her for a moment longer. Then he turned to Dolan. "Sergeant, give us the room." "Sir, my men are fine. 2 minutes out." Dolan got everyone out who could be moved and the ones who couldn't. Walsh Martinez, the 2 post-surgical patients, he arranged to be facing away from the conversation in the far corner, which was the best he could do. He went outside and stood in the early morning air with Eddie, Yeti, and Alvarez, and felt the strange, displaced sensation of being locked out of the most important conversation he had ever almost been part of. Eddie was the first to speak, naturally. "She's supposed to be dead." That's what he said. "What does that mean, listed as inactive?" "It means something got classified somewhere, and someone decided it was better if she wasn't officially anywhere." Eddie absorbed this. "She went off the grid." "Looks like it." Why, Dolan thought about the Naval Special Warfare Command letter. He thought about the call sign Bravo 7 on a frequency nobody at this base used. He thought about a woman who packed a single duffel bag and arrived on a supply truck and spent 6 weeks being a ghost. And he thought about how well she had done it, how completely, how naturally, and he understood for the first time that she hadn't been hiding because she was bad at being seen. She had been hiding because she was extraordinarily good at it. "I don't know," he said. "But whatever she's running from, she ran straight into this base. And I think she chose it on purpose." Alvarez, who had been quiet since the firefight ended, said she knew where she was going. She knew the drainage channel was a vulnerability. She knew the approach lanes. Dolan looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because the week she arrived," Alvarez said slowly, "she asked me to walk her through the perimeter. Said she liked to know the layout of any installation she worked in. I thought it was just, he stopped. I thought it was just careful. A nurse wanting to know evacuation routes. It wasn't evacuation routes she was mapping, Dolan said. Alvarez shook his head. No, it wasn't. Brennan came out 7 minutes later. Not 2, 7. He walked past Dolan without stopping, hands clasped behind his back and said over his shoulder, "Come with me, Sergeant." They walked to the far side of the compound, away from the QRF soldiers, away from the smoldering motor pool, away from the medical station and whatever was still happening inside it. Brennan stopped near the eastern wall, the breached wall, the wall that should have been fixed 11 weeks ago, and looked at it for a moment before turning to Dolan. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this conversation," Brennan said. "Understood. Sarah Bennett is not a nurse." Dolan waited. "She is a former Marine Scout sniper, top graduate of her class 2014. Transferred to Naval Special Warfare for a joint program cross-training, the kind of thing that doesn't get written about in any manual you'll ever read. She was good enough that they gave her a separate program. Medical integration. They wanted operators who could do both treat casualties and engage targets without switching modes." Brennan paused. "She was the proof of concept." "The proof of concept," Dolan repeated. "She could triage a sucking chest wound and take a 900-meter shot. Same breath, same hands." Brennan's voice was flat and factual, but underneath it was something Dolan recognized, the specific register of a man describing something that genuinely impressed him and was trying not to show it. "The program ran for 3 years. She was the best they had." "What happened to the program?" Brennan was quiet for a moment. "A mission went wrong. Details are classified. 2 men didn't come back. The investigation was complicated." He chose the word carefully. "Bennett requested inactive status 18 months ago. It was granted, the record was sealed. And then she turned up here. On a letter from Westfield, yes." Brennan exhaled. "I believe she chose this installation specifically. I believe she knew the vulnerability in the eastern wall. I believe she has been watching this base since she arrived, cataloging its weaknesses because that is what she does. It's not a skill. It's a reflex. She can't turn it off." He looked at Dolan directly. "She was waiting for this." Dolan felt something cold move through him. Not fear, something more complicated than fear. She knew the attack was coming. "I don't know what she knew. I know she was ready for it in a way that no one who didn't know was ready for it." "Sir, I'm not suggesting she let it happen. I'm saying she was prepared for a possibility that she may have been the only person on this base taking seriously." Brennan turned back toward the medical station. "The intelligence we had suggests a possible threat to this sector. It was assessed as low probability. Someone clearly disagreed with that assessment." Dolan thought about 6 weeks of a woman who didn't talk to anyone, who mapped the perimeter on her first week, who never looked surprised by anything, who sat on the floor with her eyes closed in the middle of a firefight and opened them 4 seconds before the door came in. "She was here to protect the base," Dolan said. It wasn't a question. "She was here," Brennan said carefully, "because she needed to be somewhere, and she chose here." He paused. "There is a difference, and I'm not sure she'd admit to either one." When Dolan walked back into the medical station, Sarah was checking Alvarez's hands. Not for wounds. She had his palms up and was looking at the tremor in his fingers, the fine post-adrenaline shake that everyone got that no one talked about. Alvarez was staring at the ceiling with the careful dignity of a man pretending not to be embarrassed. "It's normal," she said quietly to Alvarez. "Not loudly, not for the room, just for him. Every single time. Doesn't matter how many times you've been through it. The body still does this afterward." "It never happened before," Alvarez said. "Yet it did. You just weren't paying attention to your hands before." She released them. "Drink water, eat something. The shake stops faster if you give it something to metabolize." She stood up and turned around and saw Dolan standing in the doorway, and she read his face the way she read everything all at once completely. "He told you," she said. "Yes." She nodded once, turned back to the medication cabinet, began organizing things that were already organized. "How much enough?" "Then you have questions." "About 100. She pulled out a chart, looked at it, put it back. Her hands were completely steady. They had been steady all night, and they were steady now, and Dolan understood that the steadiness wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the result of training so deep it had become structural load-bearing walls inside a person, not decorative. "Ask one," she said. He thought about it. He had 100 questions, and he thought about which one mattered most in the program. The mission that went wrong. The 2 men who didn't come back, Westfield, the sealed records, Bravo 7, and he set all of them aside and asked the one that had been sitting at the back of his mind since the moment she walked through that supply truck. "Why nursing?" She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Walsh was pretending to sleep. Martinez actually was asleep. Eddie was at the door and was doing an admirable job of pretending he couldn't hear every word. Because I was tired of the other half, she said finally, of the shooting, of what happened after. She still wasn't looking at him. You take a shot, the mission ends, you move on. You never see what happens next. Whether the people you were protecting actually got help, whether they're the ones who got hurt. She stopped. Nursing puts you in the after. You see what survives, what can be saved. A pause. I needed to see that for a while. Dolan sat down in the chair next to Walsh's empty side table. His legs had been carrying him for 4 hours on no sleep, and they were done with the pretense of being fine. The mission that went wrong, he said. The 2 men. She turned around then, and for the first time all night, the first time in 6 weeks, possibly her face showed something that she hadn't chosen to show. Not for long, just long enough. I got there too late, she said. I had the shot, I had the angle, I had everything, and I was 11 seconds late getting into position. Her voice was even, but her eyes weren't. 11 seconds. That's not your fault. I know that, she said, and then very quietly, I know that up here. She touched her temple briefly. I'm still working on the other part. The room held that for a moment, just held it. Walsh, who was very obviously not asleep, said from his bed, "For what it's worth, ma'am, the 11 seconds you were late somewhere else, you were about 11 minutes early here." She looked at him, and the thing that happened to her face in that moment, Dolan watched it happen and knew he'd never be able to fully describe it to anyone. Like a lock turning over. Like a door that had been held shut from the inside opening, just a crack, just enough to let light through. "Get some sleep, Walsh," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Child. Brennan came back at 05:30. He came back with Captain Yardley, who had the expression of a woman who had arrived late to something important and was still piecing together exactly how important it had been. He came back with a lieutenant from the QRF who had been taking statements and with a satellite phone that he'd been on for the last hour, and with the look of a man who had spent that hour being told things that were changing the shape of something in his mind. He stood in the center of the medical ward and looked at Sarah, and she looked back at him, and they had one of those conversations that happen entirely without words, the kind between people who have shared context that nobody else in the room is cleared for. Then Brennan said, "Westfield wants to speak to you." "I'm sure he does." "Bennett, I'll call him." She didn't move. "After rounds." Brennan blinked. "After rounds." Martinez needs his drain checked, and Walsh's wound culture should be read by now. She looked at Yardley. "Captain, if you can cover the 2 post-surgical patients, I'll handle Martinez and Walsh, and then we can debrief." Yardley opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Brennan, looked back at Sarah. She said, which was not a word Dolan had ever heard Captain Yardley use before. "Yes, fine, of course." Brennan pinched the bridge of his nose, but Dolan caught the corner of his mouth, just the corner, just for a second, before he controlled it. It was almost a smile. The debrief took 2 hours. Dolan gave his account. Eddie gave his. Alvarez gave his. Each time the QRF lieutenant writing the report would look up from his notepad at a new detail. The rooftop shots, the vent, the radio frequency, the 9 total kills, with an expression that moved through disbelief and into something that wasn't quite awe, but lived in the same neighborhood. When it was Sarah's turn, she sat across from the lieutenant and spoke in the same flat factual tone she used for everything, and gave a full tactical account of the night that was so complete, so sequenced, so precisely detailed, that the lieutenant stopped writing at some point and just listened. When she finished, he said, "How did you know they'd try the roof vent?" "Because the front door was too obvious and the south entrance was covered. The vent was the only remaining AO with interior access and partial concealment during approach." "And you were already positioned to fire upward?" "Yes." "Before they got to the vent?" "Yes." The lieutenant looked at his notepad, then at her. "How long before?" 4 minutes approximately. "You were sitting on the floor with a rifle aimed at the ceiling 4 minutes before 2 armed men came through the vent." "I was sitting on the floor," she said. "I wasn't aiming yet. I was listening." "Listening for what?" "The way their boots sounded on the roof changed when they shifted from moving to positioning. It's a different kind of weight distribution." She paused as if deciding how much to explain. "You can hear the difference if you know what to listen for." The lieutenant put down his pen. He picked it back up. He wrote something in. Then he said very carefully the way a person speaks when they are trying to sound professional and are having trouble. "Ma'am, I have been doing this job for 6 years. I have debriefed soldiers, sailors, officers, contractors, and once a CIA asset who tried to give me a false name 4 times before I caught him." He looked at her. "I have never taken a statement like this." Sarah picked up her coffee cup, took a sip, said nothing. I'm going to need you to talk to my commanding officer. Colonel Brennan has my contact information. Not Colonel Brennan, ma'am. Higher. She set the cup down slowly, and for just a moment, just one, her eyes flicked to Dolan's across the table. Not for help, she didn't need help. For something else, something that might have been in another person, the look of someone who understood that the quiet chapter was ending. I know, she said, and that was all she said. Dolan found her outside at 700, standing near the eastern wall with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at the drainage channel that 11 armed men had come through 7 hours ago. The morning was fully arrived now, real light, real warmth, the base returning to its rhythms with the battered, stubborn resilience of places that survive things. He stood next to her. They were quiet for a while. You knew about the channel, he said. I reported it 3 weeks ago. Maintenance backlog. You put it in writing. I emailed the report to Yardley. A pause. She forwarded it. I don't know what happened after that. You were tracking it. I track everything. She said it without pride and without apology, just as fact. That's the problem with the way my brain works, Dolan. I walk into a place and I see everything that can go wrong. I see it all at once, all the time. I can't turn it off. Brennan said that. Brennan knows. It is. And she took a sip of the cold coffee and made no face about the temperature. It's useful in certain situations. Yeah, Dolan said. I'd say it last night qualified. It's also, she said quieter, now exhausting. He looked at her, at the side of her face, at the way she was looking at the drainage channel, not with anger or satisfaction, but with the tired, clear-eyed assessment of someone who had been right about a danger and taken no pleasure in being right because being right meant it had happened. 11 seconds, he said. She glanced at him. You said you were 11 seconds late somewhere else. He held her gaze. I watched you run this base's entire defensive action from a medical tent with no support staff and 6 critical patients in 7 hours, and not one of those patients died. Not one. He paused. Whatever you owe from 11 seconds, I think the account's starting to balance. She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, slow and deep and private, the movement of something that had been still for a very long time. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. And that from Sarah Bennett Dolan was beginning to understand was as close to thank you as it got. The satellite phone in her pocket buzzed. She looked at it, then at him. Westfield, she said, take it. If I take it, she said, things are going to change. I know. This was, the quiet, the routine. She looked back at the wall. It's going to end. It ended at 03:40 this morning, Dolan said. You know that. A long pause, the phone buzzed again. Yeah, she said, and she answered it. He walked away to give her privacy, and he heard only the first 4 words before he was out of range. 4 words spoken in the flat, calm voice of a woman who had spent 18 months trying to be invisible and had spent one night being undeniably, definitively, irreversibly seen. Westfield, I'm here. The call with Westfield lasted 19 minutes. Dolan knew because he timed it standing 40 meters away with his cold coffee and his 14 months of hard-won patience watching her back as she stood at the eastern wall with the phone pressed to her ear. She didn't pace. She didn't gesture. She stood the way she always stood, completely still, weight balanced like a person who had learned that movement during difficult conversations gave things away. He couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He could read the call in the set of her shoulders. The first few minutes were controlled professional. Then something shifted around the 7-minute mark and her chin dropped half an inch. Not defeat, more like a person absorbing a blow they had been expecting and had not fully prepared for anyway. Then the last 4 minutes were completely still again, and when she lowered the phone, she stood there for a moment with it at her side before she turned around. Her face was the same as always, controlled, clear, the internal weather locked behind glass, but her eyes were doing something they hadn't done all night. She walked back toward him and handed him the cold coffee she'd been holding since before the call. He took it automatically. Westfield is coming here, she said. When? Tomorrow. He's bringing 2 people from the program evaluation team. Dolan processed that. The program that was shut down. The program that was paused, she corrected, carefully. There's a difference, apparently. And what does that difference mean for you? She looked at the medical station. Through the wall of it, at whatever she could see in her mind, the patients, the vent, the ladder, the night. It means, she said slowly, that what happened last night wasn't just a defensive action. It was, in Westfield's words, a live proof of concept. Dolan felt something tighten in his chest. He's going to use it. He already is. Sarah, I know. She took the coffee back from him, looked at it. I know what it is. He's not wrong technically. Last night proved exactly what the program was designed to prove. One operator, dual capability, zero casualties. She paused. It's a good argument. It's your life. It was always my life. She said it without bitterness, but without comfort either. Just truth, flat and load-bearing. I knew what I was walking into when I requested this assignment. I knew Westfield would eventually find a way to... She stopped, reconsidered. I thought I had more time. More time for what? She was quiet. Sarah, more time for what? She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something that he wasn't expecting. Something that didn't fit the controlled, tactical, unreadable version of her he had been building in his mind all night. Something that was simply plainly human. To decide if I wanted to go back, she said. Eddie found them 10 minutes later, with the expression of a man carrying news he wasn't sure was good or bad, and had decided to deliver it quickly either way. Walsh is asking for you, he said to Sarah. He won't tell me what it's about. He just keeps saying, the nurse, and pointing at the door like I'm not getting it. Sarah handed Dolan the coffee again and went inside. Eddie watched her go, then turned to Dolan. Westfield, he said. I heard that name in the debrief. That's the Naval Special Warfare guy. Yes. He's coming here, tomorrow. Eddie absorbed this with the focused expression of someone doing math. And what happens to her when he gets here? Dolan didn't answer. Sergeant? I don't know, Eddie. Because here's what I keep thinking about. Eddie crossed his arms, leaned against the wall. She came here under a letter from this Westfield guy. She's been here 6 weeks. She mapped the base, she tracked the vulnerability in the eastern wall. She filed a maintenance report 3 weeks ago. He paused. She was ready for last night, perfectly ready. And you're telling me that's all coincidence? I'm not telling you it's coincidence. So she knew. She assessed a risk that nobody else was assessing seriously and positioned herself to handle it. Yes, Eddie was quiet for a moment. She chose this base. She chose this specific base with this specific vulnerability in this specific sector. He looked at Dolan. Why here of all the FOBs she could have... I don't know, Dolan said. And then slower, I think she needed it to matter. Whatever she was trying to work out from the program, from the mission that went wrong, she needed to do something that mattered, and she needed to do it on her own terms. He paused. This was her terms. Eddie was quiet for a long time. Then, that's either the saddest thing I've ever heard or the bravest. Might be both. Yeah, Eddie pushed off the wall. Usually is. Walsh was sitting up in bed when Sarah came in, which he was not supposed to be doing. She gave him a look that communicated this without words, and he held up one hand in preemptive surrender. I know. I'll lie back down in a second. He lowered his voice even though the 2 post-surgical patients were asleep, and Martinez was on enough sedation that he was not available for conversation. I need to tell you something. She pulled the chair close and sat. Professional posture, professional face. But she leaned slightly forward, just slightly, in the way of a person who is actually listening and not just appearing to. Before everything happened last night, Walsh said I was awake, couldn't sleep, the leg was bad. I was lying here around 0300 and I heard you on the roof. He paused. Not the shots, before the shots. I heard you up there just moving around, slowly, like you were checking something. She didn't respond. You were up there before the attack started, Walsh said. Weren't you? A long pause. Then yes. How long before? About 40 minutes. Walsh stared at her. You were on that roof 40 minutes before 12 armed men came through the eastern wall. I didn't know it would be 12, she said. I didn't know the specific approach. She chose the word deliberately. I had an assessment. An assessment, Walsh repeated. The perimeter report I filed 3 weeks ago, combined with some signals, activity we'd been seeing in this sector for the past 10 days, combined with... She stopped. I had an assessment that a window was opening for an attempt on this installation. I didn't know when exactly. I went to the roof because sleeping wasn't useful and being in position was. Walsh let that settle, let it fully settle, every implication of it, every weight of it. Then he said, you couldn't have told anyone. I filed the maintenance report. I mentioned the signals activity to Captain Yardley twice. I didn't have hard intelligence. I had pattern recognition. A pause. Well, people don't evacuate a base on pattern recognition. But you positioned yourself. Yes. Ilonism. Because if you told anyone what you were doing up there, they'd want to know how you knew. The silence stretched. And if they knew how you knew, Walsh continued, his voice very quiet now, they'd know who you were. And then the 6 weeks you spent being nobody would be over. She looked at him for a long moment. He was a corporal with a bad leg and 4 days post-op, and she had been keeping him alive in pieces, and he had just taken everything she hadn't said and laid it out with the calm precision of a man who had been in enough difficult situations to know when someone was carrying something alone that was too heavy for one person. "Walsh," she said, "you don't have to say anything. I was going to say your drain looks good." He almost laughed. It came out strange, the laugh of someone who is genuinely amused and genuinely emotional at the same time and can't fully separate the two. "Of course you were." She stood up, checked the drain, wrote in the chart. Then she set the chart down and said without looking at him, "Thank you for telling me. You already knew I was awake." "I knew you were awake. I didn't know what you heard." She picked up the chart again. "It matters that someone knows the full sequence. In case something happens." She met his eyes over the chart. "In case something happens," she confirmed. Westfield landed at 14:30 the following day. He came in a helicopter with 2 other people and 3 hard cases that nobody was allowed to touch. And he walked across the compound with the particular stride of a man who assessed every space he entered for tactical value before he assessed it for anything else. Dolan watched him from a distance and thought she learned that walk from somewhere. And he had a feeling he was looking at the somewhere behind Thorns. Westfield was taller than Dolan expected. Older, but not old, the kind of man whose age was difficult to read because the wear on his face wasn't age exactly, it was accumulated weight, the specific weathering of too many decisions with too many consequences. He had gray at his temples and clear, direct eyes that moved fast and gave away nothing, and when he shook Dolan's hand outside the medical station, the handshake was firm without performing firmness. "Staff Sergeant Dolan," Westfield said, "I've read your debrief." "Sir, you made the right calls last night." "I was following someone else's lead, sir." Something moved in Westfield's expression. "Yes," he said, "you were." He looked at the medical station door. "Is she in there?" "Since 5:30 yesterday, she's barely stopped working." "That's not surprising." Westfield looked at the door a moment longer than necessary, not hesitating, something else, something that looked almost like guilt. If a man like Westfield was capable of producing something that looked like guilt. "She's the best I've ever seen, Sergeant. In 23 years, in 2 branches through 4 different programs. The best I've ever seen." "I'm starting to understand that, sir." "She's also the most stubborn." He said it without frustration, with something closer to respect. "When she went inactive, I could have pushed. I had grounds. The program needed her, and I could have made a case." He paused. "I didn't, because she'd earned the right to step back, and I knew she'd come back when she was ready." He looked at Dolan. "I believe she chose this base because she knew I was watching. She chose it because she knew the risk profile, and she knew if she was right about the threat, I'd have my answer." Dolan stared at him. "She put herself in front of a 12-man assault force to prove a point to you." "She put herself in a position to protect people," Westfield said firmly. "The proof of concept was secondary. I want to be clear about that." He paused. "She would want me to be clear about that." Dolan thought about 11 seconds. About a woman who needed to see what survived. "She would," he agreed. The meeting happened in Colonel Brennan's office with the door closed, and it lasted 3 hours. And when the door opened, the 2 evaluation team members came out first with the expressions of people who had witnessed something they needed time to categorize. Then Brennan came out, and his face was carefully neutral in the way of a senior officer who had been handed a situation above his pay grade and was managing it with professional grace. Then Westfield came out, and he looked like a man who had asked for something and received something other than what he asked for and was still deciding how he felt about the difference. Then Sarah came out. She walked to the water cooler in the hallway, filled a cup, drank the entire thing standing up and filled it again. Then she turned around and saw Dolan standing there, and she held his gaze for a long moment, and he couldn't read it. Couldn't read it the way he'd been unable to read her since the beginning. But there was something different now in the unreadability. Like the lock was the same, but the door behind it had changed. "Well," he said, "he wants me to lead the program." Dolan went still. "The program that was paused." "Yes." "The dual capability training integration." "Yes." "As in build it, run it, train others." "Yes." He waited. "He's proposing a 6-month pilot. Based here initially, then mobile." She looked at the cup in her hands. "He wants to take what happened the other night and turn it into a curriculum. Tactical medical operators. People who can do both without the switching." She touched her temple briefly. "The whole brain, all at once. That's, Dolan tried to find the word. "That's actually a good idea." "I know it's a good idea. For the first time, a flash of something sharp in her voice, not anger, but the edge of a person who had been told their idea was a good idea by the person who originally told them the idea was too complicated. I know because I built the first version of it. Sarah, he wants an answer by end of week. Dolan set down what he was holding. What do you want? She looked at him. The question landed differently than she expected. He could see that. The tilt of her head, the brief reset, like she had been bracing for something different, and his question required a different kind of answer. I want Martinez's blood pressure to stay where it is, she said. I want Walsh to be walking in 6 weeks. I want Alvarez to stop apologizing for the hand tremor he had after the firefight. She paused. I want the new medic I've been drilling to know wound packing well enough to save someone's life when I'm not in the room. That's what you want for them. She looked at the floor, then back up. I don't know what I want for me, she said. I haven't known for about 18 months. Then don't decide for someone else, Dolan said. Don't decide because Westfield needs an answer, or because the program needs a director, or because what happened the other night makes a good argument for something. He held her gaze. Decide because you know. Something in her jaw shifted. The faintest thing, the kind of internal movement that only showed on the surface for a fraction of a second before being controlled. But he saw it. He had been watching her face for a day and a half now, and he had gotten marginally better at seeing the things she let slip through. You sound very certain about that, she said. I'm certain about very little, he said honestly, but I watched you in that building all night, and I don't think what you did in there was program evaluation. I think it was just who you are, all of it. The shooting and the nursing, in the way you talked to Alvarez about his hands, in the way you knew Walsh was awake, in the way you... He stopped, recalibrated. The question isn't whether the program is a good idea. It's whether it's your life or just your resume. She was quiet for a long time. Westfield came around the corner and stopped when he saw them. Looked at Sarah, looked at Dolan, made the correct assessment about what kind of conversation he had interrupted, and said nothing. Just waited. Sarah looked at him. I need 48 hours. Westfield nodded once. You have it. She walked back toward the medical station. At the door, she paused, hand on the frame, back to both of them. Then she said without turning Dolan, yeah. Walsh's next wound culture is at 0800. If I'm still in Brennan's office doing paperwork, I need you to make sure someone is there for it. I'll be there. She went inside. Westfield watched the door close. Then he looked at Dolan with an expression that was complicated and tired, and underneath both of those things, quietly proud. She likes you, he said. I think she tolerates me, Dolan said. From her, that's the same thing. That night, Dolan couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot in the dark and listened to the bass, the generators, the gravel, the radio chatter bleeding through the walls, and thought about a woman who had arrived on a supply truck with one duffel bag and spent 6 weeks being nobody, and one night being undeniably, irreversibly someone. He thought about 11 seconds and what they had cost. He thought about the 2 men she hadn't saved and the 11 she had. He thought about a program that had been paused because a mission went wrong, and what it meant that the person who carried that weight the heaviest was the one being asked to build the next version of the thing. He thought about what she'd said, I don't know what I want for me. I haven't known for about 18 months. He thought about the fact that she'd been on that roof 40 minutes before the attack in the dark alone, with a rifle across her knees, not because she'd been ordered to, not because anyone had asked, but because she had done the math and decided that if something was going to happen to the people in that building, it was going to have to come through her first. He thought that's not a decision you make because of a program. That's not a decision you make because of a colonel or a proposal or a 6-month piloted initiative. That's a decision you make because of who you are. And at 0345, nearly exactly 24 hours after the first explosion had hit the motor pool, he heard boots on gravel outside his tent. Slow and measured. Someone walking a perimeter in the dark. He didn't get up to check. He didn't need to. He just listened to the footsteps, that particular perfectly even cadence that he now recognized the way you recognized a voice making their steady way around the edge of the compound. Not restless, not anxious, purposeful. The walk of a person who checked the walls because the walls needed checking, and who would go on checking them as long as there were people on the inside worth protecting. He closed his eyes. Around the compound in the dark, Sarah Bennett walked the perimeter. And somewhere in the last of the night, listening to those steady footsteps, Ray Dolan finally slept. She gave Westfield her answer at 0600 on the second morning. Not in Brennan's office, not over the satellite phone. She walked to the east side of the compound where Westfield was standing with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had not slept much either, and she stood next to him and looked at the repaired drainage channel. A maintenance crew had been on it since yesterday afternoon, 8 hours too late, And both of them knew it, and she said without preamble, without softening, I'll do it, but on my terms. Westfield didn't show relief. He wasn't the kind of man who showed relief, but something in his posture shifted a fraction of an inch, a single degree, the way a structure settles when a load is properly distributed. Tell me your terms. The program stays integrated with active medical care. It's not a training program that happens to include medicine. It's a medical program that incorporates tactical capability. That distinction matters, and I will not negotiate it. Agreed. The candidates I select, not you, not the evaluation team, me. A pause, shorter than she expected. Agreed. And the mission that went wrong, Torres and Hagen. She said their names carefully, the way you carry something fragile. Their records get corrected. The investigation findings get reviewed. I'm not doing this with that still sitting the way it's sitting. This pause was longer. Westfield looked at the drainage channel. His jaw moved slightly, then, that will take time. I know, I'm not asking for it today. I'm asking for your word that it happens. He looked at her, directly. The clear, weighted look of a man who understood that what was being asked of him was not a bureaucratic favor, but a debt. You have my word. She nodded once. Then we have a deal. He extended his hand. She shook it. And that was that. No ceremony, no speeches, no moment that announced itself as important. Just two people standing at a repaired wall in the early morning, shaking hands over something that was going to change both of their lives and the lives of people they hadn't met yet. Westfield said, you should know Brennan requested to host the pilot program here. She looked at him. He made the case to command yesterday afternoon, said this installation had already demonstrated the operational value of the concept. A pause. He was persuasive. She looked at the medical station, at the roof she'd stood on 2 nights ago with a rifle, and the cold dark and 11 armed men coming toward the people she'd decided were hers to protect. At the wall, Walsh would walk past in 6 weeks if his wound culture stayed clean. At the door, Eddie had held with his hands shaking and his jaw set and his feet planted. Brennan didn't do that for the program, she said. No, Westfield agreed. He did it for you. She told Dolan at 700 outside the medical station before rounds. She said it the same way she said everything flat factual, no decoration. I'm staying. The program launches here. 6-month pilot. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded slow and certain, the nod of a man who had already known. Okay. That's it. Okay. What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something. He considered. Walsh is going to be insufferably pleased with himself. She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth moved a small real thing. He already thinks he talked me into it. Didn't he? He clarified my thinking, she said. There's a difference. Right. Dolan crossed his arms. And the new medic, the one you've been drilling on, wound packing. Vasquez. He's good. Better than he thinks he is. She paused. He's going to be the first candidate I evaluate for the program. Does he know that? Not yet. He's going to lose his mind. He's going to work harder than he's ever worked in his life, she corrected. Which is different from losing his mind, though it might feel similar. She shifted the chart she was carrying to her other arm. I'm going to need support staff. Someone with institutional knowledge of this base who can serve as liaison while the program is setting up. Dolan looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had already made a decision and was giving the other party the courtesy of feeling like it was a conversation. Sarah, you know this base better than anyone. You know the people. You know the vulnerabilities. A beat. You know how to follow orders from someone who doesn't hold your rank. That last part, he said, was unnecessary. It was accurate. He exhaled through his nose, looked at the ground, looked back up. I'd have to put in a formal request. Brennan already approved it. He stopped. When, this morning? 5:30. You asked Brennan before you asked me. I confirmed availability before extending an offer, she said. It's more efficient. He stared at her, and then for the first time properly with full commitment, he laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one from somewhere lower than his chest, the kind that surprised him on the way out. You are something else, he said. Is that a yes? Yeah, he said. That's a yes. The morning that Walsh took his first steps was 11 days after the attack. He made it 6 feet before his leg reminded him it had opinions about ambition, and he grabbed the IV stand and held on with both hands and said a word that Sarah pretended not to hear. Then he stood there upright, breathing hard, gripping that IV stand like it owed him money, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been horizontal for too long and was rediscovering the specific satisfaction of being vertical. 6 feet, he said. Good, she said. That's all you have got. Good. What would you prefer? He thought about it. Something with more enthusiasm. Walsh, she said, if you make it to 12 feet tomorrow, I will personally tell Colonel Brennan that your recovery is ahead of schedule, which means you go home 2 weeks early. Is that enthusiastic enough? He blinked. That's enthusiastic enough. Then keep moving. He kept moving. Dolan was in the doorway when it happened, and he watched the whole thing. Walsh's determination, Sarah's precision, the quiet transaction between a patient who needed to be pushed and a woman who understood exactly how hard to push. And he thought about what Westfield had said. The best I've ever seen in 23 years. He was starting to believe it, not because of the rooftop shots or the vent or the coordinated defensive action. He was starting to believe it because of the way she handled Walsh's 12 feet, because of the way she drilled Vasquez every morning for 6 straight days until the kid could pack a wound in the dark with his hands shaking and get it right, because of the way she'd sat with Martinez the night his fever spiked 3 in the morning. Nobody asked her to. She was just there talking him through it in that low, steady voice until his temperature came down and he fell asleep. Because the shooting and the nursing were not two different things with her. They came from the same place, the same refusal to let people go. That was the thing the program was built on. That was the thing nobody had been able to name properly until they watched her do it in real time. Dolan had a word for it now. He'd had it since the morning after the attack, standing at the drainage channel listening to Westfield. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. Vasquez found out about the program on a Tuesday. Sarah sat him down in the supply room, just the two of them, no ceremony, and told him in plain language what the program was, what it would require, and what she believed he was capable of. She did not oversell it. She did not soften the hard parts. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, completely accurately, without decoration. When she finished, Vasquez was quiet for a long time. He was 24 years old from El Paso, and he had been a combat medic for 2 years and a corpsman for 6 months before arriving at Kestrel. He was not the most naturally gifted person Sarah had seen. She had seen naturally gifted, and naturally gifted had its own problems. But he worked with the specific, hungry diligence of someone who understood that talent was a starting point and not a destination. Why me, he said finally. Because you listen, she said, and because when you don't understand something, you say so instead of pretending. That's rarer than it should be. He looked at his hands. I'm not a shooter. Not yet. I don't have a sniper background. I don't have the tactical Vasquez. She waited until he looked up. I'm not looking for someone who already is. I'm looking for someone who can become. Those are completely different people. She held his gaze. Do you understand the difference? He thought about it, really thought the way she'd taught him to think all the way through, not stopping at the first answer. Someone who already is, he said slowly, thinks they know what they are. Someone who can become is still open. Yes. And you think I'm still open. I know you are. She stood up. You have 48 hours to decide. Don't give me an answer before then. Think about it properly. He gave her his answer in 36 hours. It was yes. Sure. The formal launch of the pilot program happened on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the attack, with no ceremony that Sarah had agreed to, and one short ceremony that Brennan insisted on and she tolerated. Brennan stood in front of the medical station with a small group, Dolan Westfield's evaluation team, Captain Yardley, a handful of Marines from the base who had requested to attend and been permitted to, and he spoke for 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes and 52 seconds longer than Sarah would have preferred. He talked about what had happened the night of the attack. He talked about what it had demonstrated. He talked about the program, the concept, the structure, the unprecedented nature of what they were attempting. He was measured and he was specific, and he was, as Dolan had said, persuasive. And then he said the program will be led by Senior Tactical Medical Advisor Sarah Bennett, whose actions on the night of the 14th demonstrated everything this program is designed to produce and reminded every one of us that the line between protecting and healing has always been thinner than we imagined. Sarah stood at the edge of the group and received this without visible reaction, which was to say, she received it the way she received everything completely internally, giving nothing back to the room. But Dolan was standing next to her and he saw her hands. She had them clasped in front of her the way she always stood when she was at rest. And the knuckles were white, not from fear, not from resistance, from the effort of holding something inside that was pressing outward, the specific physical manifestation of a person receiving something they had needed for a long time and did not know how to accept gracefully. When Brennan finished, people clapped. Brief military efficient applause. Sarah looked at the ground for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked up and she said, all right, let's get to work. And that was the ceremony. 3 days into the pilot program, Eddie Reyes requested to be evaluated for candidacy. He came to Dolan first, which Dolan later understood was not because he needed permission, but because he needed someone to tell it to before he said it out loud to someone who mattered. I want in, he said, the program. I want to be evaluated. You're a rifleman, Eddie, not a medic. I know. She said the program would take candidates from both sides, tactical and medical. Pair them up, build cross-competency. He was talking fast, not nervously, but with the energy of someone who had been thinking about something for days and finally had an outlet. She said the goal isn't to make shooters into nurses or nurses into shooters. It's to make people who can hold both at once without the gap in between, the switching cost. Dolan looked at him, 23 years old from Albuquerque with opinions about everything. The same kid who had said something's off about her on day 3. The same kid who had held the door of the medical station with shaking hands and planted feet and not moved. You sure, Dolan said. I've been sure since the night. She said, drive them right, and I did it, and it worked. Eddie's voice was steady, certain in the way of young men who have found the specific thing they were built for and recognized it instantly. I've never been more sure of anything. Dolan nodded. Talk to her. What do I say? You say what you just said to me. Exactly that. She'll tell you what she thinks. Eddie went. He came back 2 hours later with the expression of a man who had been evaluated and found not lacking, not approved, but somewhere more interesting than either. She said, I'll know by the end of the first week whether I'm a candidate or not, he reported. She said she can tell in 5 days. What does she do in 5 days? Eddie shook his head slowly. She watches, he said. That's it. She just watches. She said most people reveal everything you need to know in the first 5 days if you know what to look for. Dolan thought about a woman who had arrived on a supply truck and revealed nothing in 6 weeks. He thought about how long it had taken all of them, himself included, to see what was in front of them. He thought about the fact that she had been watching all of them from day 1, that the evaluation had never stopped, that the woman they thought didn't pay attention to anyone had been paying complete attention to all of them, cataloging, assessing, deciding, and that the people she chose to trust to rely on to pull into the hardest moments of the hardest night, she had chosen them long before they knew she was looking. He said none of this to Eddie. He just said, then be worth watching. On the last day of the 3rd week, Martinez was discharged. He walked out of the medical station on his own feet with a scar on his left side that he would carry for the rest of his life. And he stopped in the doorway and looked back at Sarah, who was already at the next patient's chart, already moving, because that was the thing about her. She never stopped moving toward the next thing that needed her. Hey, Martinez said. She looked up. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was 27 years old and he had almost died twice in the last month. And he had been looked after by this woman through both of them, and there were not words in his vocabulary for the size of what he wanted to say. He knew that. He could feel the gap between the feeling and the language available to express it, and it was vast. So he just said, thank you. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something she very rarely did. She set down the chart, fully, put it on the counter, and turned to face him without something in her hands, without a task between them. Take care of the scars, she said. Vitamin E twice a day starting next week. Don't let anyone tell you it's cosmetic. Scar tissue has real implications for tissue mobility, and you'll feel it if you ignore it. Okay, he said. And Martinez. She paused. You were a good patient. You did everything right. The fever on night 3, you breathed through it the way I told you to, and you didn't panic, and that matters more than you know. She held his gaze. You saved your own life too, remember that. He stood in the doorway for one more second. Then he nodded once solid, the nod of a man filing something away in a permanent place, and he walked out into the morning. Sarah picked up the chart. She kept moving. Walsh got his 12 feet on day 2. He got 20 on day 3. By the end of the week, he was walking the length of the ward without the IV stand, and the wound culture was clean, and Sarah wrote in his discharge notes under clinical progress in her precise, undecorated handwriting, 2 weeks ahead of projected timeline. When she handed him the notes, he read that line and looked up at her. You said I'd go home 2 weeks early. You will. You also said you'd tell Brennan my recovery was ahead of schedule. I already did. Yesterday. He stared at her. You did it before I hit the milestone. I did it when I knew you would. She tucked the pen in her pocket. There's a difference between waiting for proof and knowing. He held the discharge notes for a moment. Then he folded them carefully the way you fold something you intend to keep. Can I ask you something? You always ask anyway. When you were on that roof, he said, before the attack. 40 minutes in the dark by yourself, not knowing exactly when or how were you scared. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she might route around the question entirely, which would have been her right and he would have accepted it. But she said yes. He nodded slowly, like that was important, like that mattered to him in a specific way, that he needed her to know. Good, he said quietly, because I've been thinking about it, thinking about all of it, and the part that gets me isn't the shots. It isn't the vent or the radio or any of it. It's that you were up there scared and you stayed anyway. He looked at her. That's the part that means something. She looked back at him, and the lock turned again further, this time the door opening wider, something real and unguarded coming through in the set of her eyes, and the line of her jaw, and the small, steady breath she took before she answered. It always meant something, she said. I just needed somewhere to put it. Dolan found her that evening on the eastern wall. Not the roof, the wall itself. She was standing at the section that had been repaired, one hand resting on the new concrete, looking out at the distance where 12 men had come from 3 weeks ago. The base was quiet around them. The generators hummed, the stars were out. He stood next to her. They were quiet for a long time, in the easy quiet of people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. Then she said, Vasquez packed a wound in 4 minutes and 12 seconds today, in the dark. Is that good? The standard is 6 minutes in optimal conditions. She looked at the wall. He's going to be exceptional. You knew that in 5 days. I knew it in 3. A pause. I gave him 5 so he wouldn't know I decided. That's either kind or tactical. Usually both, she said. He smiled at the dark. The program's going to work. Yes. You're going to build something real here. Yes? She said it without arrogance and without false modesty. Just affirmation. The word of a person who had stopped second-guessing the thing they knew. And you're okay, he asked. Not the sergeant voice, not the professional voice. Just the question, just Ray Dolan asking Sarah Bennett if she was okay and meaning it the full honest way. She considered it. She gave it real thought, which was the thing about her. She never answered the question she could get away with. She always answered the actual one. I'm the best I've been in 18 months, and she said, I'm not where I'm going yet, but I know what direction that is now. She took her hand off the wall and looked at it for a moment, the hand that had been steady through all of it, the hand that packed wounds and held rifles and checked IV lines and took pulses and once held a pen over a maintenance report that nobody acted on in time. I can feel the difference between running away and running towards something. I couldn't always. She closed her hand. I can now. He nodded. They stood together at the repaired wall as the base settled into night. Around them, the sounds of it familiar. Now the generators and the gravel and the radio chatter, all the ordinary noise of a place where people were on and working and going about the daily business of surviving. Then Dolan said, for the record, what I said in the beginning that she was just a nurse. You never said that. I thought it. Everyone thought it. She looked at him sideways, the corner of her mouth. That was the point. Yeah, he exhaled. Well, I was wrong. Yes, she said, you were. And there it was, not forgiveness because there was nothing to forgive. Not reassurance because she didn't traffic in reassurance. Just the plain direct acknowledgement of a woman who had spent 6 weeks being nobody and was done pretending. Who had spent 18 months carrying 11 seconds and was learning to put them down. Who had spent a lifetime being built for exactly this. The hard thing, the necessary thing, the thing that nobody else was positioned to do and had finally, after all of it, stopped arguing with herself about it. She was a Marine. She was a sniper. She was a nurse. She was a teacher and a guardian and a proof of concept and a woman who walked perimeters in the dark because the walls needed watching. She was all of it at once without switching. She was exactly who she had always been. And standing at that repaired wall in the quiet of the night with the stars out and the base alive around her and the work beginning in the morning, Sarah Bennett was not running from anything anymore. She was exactly where she chose to be. And she was staying.